Welcome in to the RotoViz Fantasy Football Show. My name is Colm Kelly. Delighted to be here as always, but this is a solo pod, and I just thought I would jump on, have some conversation around a couple of different topics as we get ready for the NFL season. But one of the shows that people kind of ask us every year to do is around the players that will, make the biggest difference to our season, either positively or negatively. And today I'm going to run through some of the players who are my highest exposed players, and then some players maybe that I didn't draft towards the end that I'm maybe a little bit afraid that may come back to haunt me a little bit. We were planning to do this as a combined pod, myself and Sean. It's something we usually bounce back and forth off the players on our accounts that are most drafted. There does be quite a bit of crossover based on some of the drafts we do together, and then obviously the drafts we do solo. There's a lot of same player targets and profiles that we are looking to draft. So we're going to do that later in the show. We were also planning for this to kind of be a crossover week where we were going to do a couple of drafts over at the FFPC, one in the Big Gorilla, one in the Main Event, and then we were going to post them up on the RotoViz Fantasy Football podcast feed, because I haven't had Sean on as a guest over there. I guess maybe some people might say that's a little bit like, cheating. You're having a guest, but it's your regular co-host. But people love listening to Sean's thoughts. So we were going to do those two drafts, post them across the RotoViz Overtime and the RotoViz Fantasy Football podcast feeds. But as things have it, Sean had some travel chaos. I think some people... there's other words you could use for it, but I was going to use the phrase roadblock, but it was air related in terms of flight trouble with delays and cancellations. So we did miss out on being able to do that as a live draft in the Big Gorilla contest, but we are set for an FFPC Main Event draft on Monday afternoon, evening time. And we will be posting that up on the RotoViz Overtime podcast feed and the RotoViz Fantasy Football podcast feed over the next kind of couple of days, probably in the next 24 hours. You'll also be able to get that over on the video side as well over on YouTube. But that is kind of the layout of the plan. That's why we've bumped this into a solo show. And I did get some positive feedback as well on the auction strategy show I did a couple of weeks back. People seem to really like how that one came out. So I may do some more solo stuff during the season if people are enjoying the way that is going. And on that kind of topic, we will be laying out our in-season plans for the content during the season. That'll become very clear, obviously, very soon, because we are entering week one here. We're recording this on Monday, obviously Thursday Night Football kicking things off before we get into a full week of action. So I'm excited for the NFL season to come right around. And of course, I know people listening to this are excited for that as well. So we will be setting up whether we do the recaps, whether we do previews, all the different things and how that content could come out between Stealing Bananas, RotoViz Overtime, the RotoViz Fantasy Football Show. So we're still in the process of working out exactly how that's going to be in play. But this is where I want your help, and that is, what would you like to see on those feeds? Would you like to see instant recaps? Would you like to see, previews, waivers? What would be some of the topics you would like? Would you like it to be like a mailbag where we answer listener questions, at the end of each week, maybe even a live Q&A over on the YouTube side? There's lots of ways we could play it out. And if I'm doing these solo shows, that opens the door for some other opportunities, as well as having guests on to talk with myself, or me and Sean talk, or Ben and Sean talk. You'll be covered with content either way, but just looking for some feedback and suggestions from the RotoViz community. So you can send them my way on social media at Overtime Ireland, or email them across at rotovizradio@gmail.com. We'll try and use out some of those suggestions. We love to get the community involved with the suggestions for what they want the content to be. And before I get into the players that I'm talking about deciding my season, who I've maybe drafted too much of, and some of these names that I'm going to talk about in a moment, I was surprised myself when I toggled over to the management or the ownership level tab and my account, and see just how it shook out, and then I filtered it into some of the individual contests. So we'll see players that maybe it might have felt like I was a little bit down on, that ended up being the best pick at those particular draft slots. So we'll talk about that in just a minute. But when we come on these shows, we have a great community around RotoViz, and I do want to say thank you to everyone who's listened in throughout the course of the off season. It's been great all the way back to the end of last season. It's been great for many, many years, but from the end of last season into the rookie stuff, looking at the prospects, into the draft, into the rookie drafts for Dynasty, through the best ball season, into the redraft season, it's been fantastic to have that interaction with the RotoViz community, the listeners, and getting to know a lot of people over the course of the last few years. It's always awesome to have that interaction. So I want to say thank you, but I also want to say good luck for the season. And I hope that some of the players I'm going to talk about now are on your rosters and they lead to fantasy success for you this season. Maybe some of our listeners win the BBM. Maybe some of them win the FFPC Main Event. Those stories come in at the end of the season and they always kind of reinvigorate us to go for another year and do all this all over again. So I really do appreciate each and everyone that listens in, each person that reaches out with comments and interaction, drops us reviews. If you haven't dropped us a review, perfect time to do that as we get ready for the season. Whether it's Apple or Spotify, they tend to be the two where it's most easy to do. Rate your favorite RotoViz podcast content. We would really appreciate that. But let's get into some of these players that we're going to discuss. So I'm going to dive into some of the names first, just from a general overview, and then I might dive a little bit into, the contest, because I'm taking some of this from, across my complete portfolio best ball. There is some dynasty in there. There will be some redraft as well. But in general, I'll give you an overview of the teams. But some of these, when I break it down by particular contests, it's pretty staggering as to how many times I've drafted some of these players in specific formats. Sometimes you'll have players that you have across different particular instances, like a best ball team or like a redraft team. But in some of the specific contests, like the FFPC $125 tournament or the $35 tournament, there's certain ways that I like to draft and put teams together, and that leads to having very familiar lineups towards the end of most drafts. And it might be that only there's a crossover of 5 players, but if those 5 players keep going in a range where you're like, this is a flat range and this is the best player available, and this is the way I'm going to continue this roster out, and then the teams continue to be that way, sometimes you get a heavier exposure than you would like. And I've talked about this in the past. I tend to lean in to the players I like and go for them. There will be drafts where there's maybe a player I don't like and it fits a roster. I actually had a draft in the FFPC Superflex contest yesterday where I drafted Jaden Daniels at the 103, and then later on it got to a flat spot and I didn't have the elite tight end that I would like to have, and I was kind of building out kind of 3 or 4 tight ends in a 4 to 5 range period, in the double digit rounds, and it popped up, one of the options that is available for me there was Zach Ertz, and I drafted him, and he's somebody who very rare. I would imagine that's the only share I have of him in that particular contest, and probably across best ball this season, just by the way I've been building the teams, trying to get some of those top end tight ends and then building it out with different options, in the mid range, and then looking to get some of those late guys. People will know that I talk a lot about Jatavion Sanders. We talk a lot about Harold Fanning on these podcasts, those sort of names, trying to get them into the roster. So sometimes there'll be cases like that, but the majority of the times I'm sticking to my guys, and you'll see that as we go through here. If we go to overall formats across the board, JSN, Jerry Jeudy, and Brashad Smith lead the way as my most drafted players. The 3 of those, and people may be surprised at the percentages, as I say, I lean in and I go for it for the season. If it works out, it works out. If it doesn't, it doesn't. But these are players that I'm going to be leaning heavily on and relying on this season. So we have JSN, Jerry Jeudy, Brashad Smith at a whopping 62%. Now, some of that, as I mentioned, will be in different formats like Dynasty, for example, over on the FFPC. We're playing the RotoViz Triflex leagues, and if I flip it over to the Superflex tournament, for example, I mentioned my boy Jatavion Sanders. Get me some 80% in the Superflex Jatavion Sanders, please. So in that format, JSN actually drops down a little bit in terms of how much I have rostered him. But Jerry Jeudy, for example, in that $125 best ball tournament over at the FFPC, I've drafted 75% of the time. So that's 3 out of every 4 times. But I just feel like he's a very mispriced wide receiver at a very good price with everything factored in that has a massive ceiling in 2025. So he is somebody there, for example, that is that's astronomical, and it probably shouldn't be as high, but that tends to be the way I'll let a couple of players leak into the formats like that each season, and Jerry Jeudy is one of my guys to draft this season. Somebody else we talked a lot about in the rookie draft season, we have continued to talk about, RJ Harvey's on 43% of the rosters that I have. Cam Scadaboo also features on 43. One of the ones that I'm getting a little bit more nervous about over the last couple of weeks with his foot injury, Jaden Reed is in that percentage around the 40 mark. And then we're looking at some of the kind of late value options. I find in general, the reason the JSN one, when I talked about him there, surprised me as much as it did is I talked a lot at the start of the draft season where he was going kind of at the 2-3 turn a lot of the time. And, that was, I felt a little bit expensive for where he was going. Filters in now a lot of the time particularly in the FFPC drafts at the 3-4 turn. And that kind of allows you at the end of a tier there to go in that direction. It's really at that point, you're looking at, Jaden Daniels will be failed, JSN, Trevion Henderson as an option. There's been some times in that FFPC format recently where I might have taken Trevion Henderson in the 3rd round late, and then JSN makes it back to you in the 4th round. And I think then when you're looking at some of the names that are going there, Garrett Wilson, Mike Evans, Marvin Harrison, Devontae Adams, it makes all the sense in the world for me to click on JSN there. I'm reaching down below that then to like Ted McMillan, Xavier Worthy, but I'm kind of also hoping maybe you get those at different spots and different drafts. And I'm kind of taking a little bit of the ADP play on JSN and those particular formats. And that one, I have to say, out of all the names, surprised me because of the draft capital involved. And I'm saying you might get them in the 4th, but you are still at the early rounds of a draft. And that's not usually somewhere where I'm diving in as heavy on individual players. I tend to have those kind of percentages that I've mentioned there on players and kind of rounds 8 and beyond. And quite often with some of the names that I'm going to talk about in a second, you'll find that those names tend to be, let's say, in the kind of 15 plus rounds, where when you're getting them, if you think they're going to really exponentially beat ADP, and those situations, you're like, well, I can take, like I mentioned, Jatavion Sanders, I can take Jarquez Hunter, I can take those sort of names. Like one of the names here that's on the list in the high 30s is Trevor Etienne. Like Trevor Etienne, for example, in a lot of these formats is going either undrafted or in the last round. Like in that super flex contest, he's often going undrafted. When we look into like the other formats, you may see him in the 20th round of the Superflex tournament, but in the Best Ball tournament. But it's not a case that he's getting drafted highly. So when you're taking those risks and adding them to your roster, that's a much easier proposition for Rashad Smith, who I mentioned a minute ago, where currently, if we look at the Best Ball tournament, which is now closed at the FFPC, finished up at the 1901 as an ADP. Jarquez Hunter, I'm going to touch on now in a second, running back 74, the middle of the 19th round. So you're not necessarily having to put your capital really in one direction because it's very late in the draft and you're looking for some upside scenarios at that particular point. And when we get into some of the higher price names, like Brock Bowers is a player who people have watched some of the recent main events that Ben and Sean done, or some of the drafts that me and Sean have done. I've done drafts with Kevin as well on the channel, and a player that we've drafted very aggressively in tight end premium formats. Make no surprise to anyone listening is Brock Bowers. So Bowers is somebody like we've talked about. When you're at a certain spot of the draft, like you have to just take him because you're not going to get him. So if you have a 105 or a 104, you might get him through there in the tight end premium format. But we've had some 102s or 103s that we've taken Brock Bowers in those particular situations, partly because you're afraid that maybe later in draft season you don't get those ADPs or you don't get those draft slots, and then that means that you're in a situation where you end up with none of him. So I was happy to see that I've shook out at the 30% mark. So that's again, 3 out of every 10 for people doing their counting at home. But that's a lot overall in terms of like, I think if you talk to some people around the industry, and I've had people on the RotoViz Fantasy Football podcast this offseason, and those percentages of a 30% player in kind of a first round of ADP would be something that a lot of people wouldn't recommend. So I fully understand if people feel that that's overly aggressive or I'm overweighting those players. But when it's players that I really specifically believe in, and that can be a complete difference maker and help you potentially win a tournament, I'm going to take those risks. If I finish this season and I've bankrolled all the other drafters in the contest, that's all well and good. But in the past, this same strategy has helped me have very successful seasons. So you'll have some down years, but you'll have some pretty big hits if you hit on these names as well. So I'm hoping that works out. Brock Bowers, obviously tethered to Geno Smith. Not necessarily that I love Geno Smith from a fantasy scoring perspective. I do like him. I think he's underrated as an actual NFL quarterback and what he's able to do for a team. But I do think if you think Brock Bowers is going to have a big season this year and you're playing in some of these formats where, even a super flex, but where people are maybe undervaluing Geno Smith. I think it's like the kind of thing. If you're betting on Bowers, you kind of need to be betting on his quarterback as well. So pretty high in terms of Geno Smith being my highest rostered QB, along with Bo Nix across all formats. So the Bo Nix one I do know just from my own portfolio is boosted significantly by the dynasty element. So most of that, when I'm looking here at the complete overview of the teams, is going to be Bo Nix and other formats boosting that number, where I know Geno Smith is much more a player that has been drafted to be tethered as a stack to Brock Bowers and these particular tournaments. Another player I mentioned being a little bit concerned with having drafted Jaden Reed with his injury, still optimistic for how that'll work out, how the Packers offense works out going forward, but I'm much more enthusiastic about Golden's potential as a rookie than I was kind of pre-draft, even post-draft. The injury to Reed is concerning because it's not going to be healed. He's likely to play through it. So if he can play through it, it depends then on how much success he can have based on the injury, and then based on if it's a case that they're like, this isn't working, we need to shut you down for a prolonged period or for the entire season. So we'll see how it plays out with Jaden Reed, but I'm hoping for both Jaden Reed, my fantasy portfolio, and my Green Bay Packers that it works out here. Obviously a monster trade that they pulled off over the last week, and one of those kind of scenarios that when the rumors are out there, I felt, this isn't something the Packers normally do, so it's probably not going to come to fruition. But a pretty massive trade, giving up the draft capital, which hopefully will be late round. This is what we talk about in Dynasty. You're like, they're going to be late 2026 picks. Well, what happens if Jordan Love's hand isn't healed, or Jaden Reed can't play, and then the offense struggles? Maybe they end up being the 10th overall pick. So there's those sort of scenarios that you have to play out as well from a dynasty or from an NFL team building perspective. But pretty exciting to get somebody like Micah Parsons jumping across and joining your roster rather than having him chase down your quarterback. So that is a fun move for the Packers. Ted McMillan, somebody we've talked a massive amount about over the last few weeks. We've been aggressive drafting him early. He's on about a third of the rosters, but the other part with McMillan is we've been aggressive, we've been drafting him early, but it also feels like, I wish maybe I had snuck some more onto the roster at the cheaper cost, but he is in there in that kind of 27 to 30% range. But there are some of the names that are at that early part. And the thing that you'll notice with the names that I'm going to kind of mention here, Jaden Reed, somebody who kind of people will say underperformed last year, but the entire offense struggled with the Packers. And if you look at the overall numbers, there's a lot to be positive about for him heading into this season and how that could expand, minus the conversation I just had around Golden and how he looks and the capital obviously spent on him this season by the Packers in the draft. But him, Jerry Jeudy, JSN, they're all kind of players that there's a number of question marks about. And when I say question marks, there's like ways I can see how they don't play out, but I'm also enthusiastic about their situation and their talent. But when we look at across the fantasy community, I think, the likes of a JS, and particularly Jerry Jeudy, I noticed from the YouTube comments and the feedback comes up like very regularly. Every time we talk about him or every time we draft about him, there's comments kind of been like, this guy only did it with Jameis Winston. He won't do it. Well, he's in a situation now where Joe Flacco is the starting quarterback. And like if we look at those Colts receivers, the most success that they had was with Joe Flacco playing QB with them. He can get those fantasy points. He passed it as an actual NFL quarterback, but he's going to be able to make this team and offense move quite well. And I'm optimistic about Dylan Gabriel as well if he gets his opportunity later in the year. But yeah, like Chris Olave is another name on this list that pops up. Like there's injury concerns, there's reasons it could go wrong. But again, you're betting on the talent, you're betting on how that could play out. Another person who fits into the quarterback could be the issue scenario there for him as well. But there are some of the names that are like in the most high owned category or drafted category. A lot of young players when we're looking at it, Dylan Sampson, another. I was drafting a lot of Cleveland Browns over the course of the draft season, and some of the names that I mentioned that have factored in there already. But David Njoku, somebody who I think there can be excitement about with a Joe Flacco led team. Dylan Sampson, based on how the running back situation is playing out there. There's a lot of ways like Cedric Tillman. I think there's a post type continuation of a potential breakout prior to his injury that could happen there. So there's lots of ways to look at it. And then as we move down the list, there's going to be a lot of names in here that are, the RotoViz OT favorites. And I guess when I'm at this point, something that I haven't got to update this season yet. I have a 11-month-old about to turn 1 year old here when it enters in between week 1 and week 2 of the NFL season. So there has been some things that I have not been able to do that I normally do on a yearly basis for the OT podcast. And one of them is setting up, the intro music and what players play in that. And some of the names there, I guess people would say they're not as in on those names in 2025 as they were in previous seasons. And that's just because we haven't got a chance to flip it around. There's some names in there that still really hold true. And there's some names in there that I think could bounce back. But some of these names that pop up here have been like kind of old school favorites. And, we can't call him an old school favorite yet, but Jaden Daniels is one of the third highest rostered QB across formats. So we did a lot of conversation earlier this off season around elite quarterbacks and what that means in this particular ADP landscape. And we talked there a moment ago about drafting JSN, and one of the other reasons, is you get into a flat area there where the elite quarterbacks also go. If you're playing in Superflex as well and you have an early pick, Jaden Daniels becomes an obvious pick, and he's somebody that's rostered across my dynasty rosters quite a bit as well. So his percentage is boosted a little bit by the dynasty stuff, boosted a little bit by the ADP environment this year. He plays in there. And another one that we've talked a lot about, and how we kind of, again, I've talked with Ted McMillan on this, and how I feel optimistic, hugely optimistic, I have to say. Again, Adam Thielen traded, and now Jalen Coker is on injured reserve for the start of the season. But if you're tethering him to have success, you're tethering that to Bryce Young. So he's another QB that falls into the list. Another player that I've thought has been mispriced since the Johnny Smith trade, Pat Freiermuth, again, a later play in terms of adding to your roster. Sam Laporte is another tight end coming in the 20% range on rosters. Another one that I don't know if it's going to work out, but more so a lot of these best ball leagues, we talk about getting up to 4 tight ends. And in that situation, if you do miss out on some of our favorite priority targets at the end of drafts, one of the names that I've had as a kind of consistent fallback has been Cole Kmet. Him and Terrence Ferguson kind of fall into that same kind of cohort of like you're in the last 2 rounds and you want to add that additional piece. I'm excited to see what Loveland does, but I still think there's a lot of talent there with Cole Kmet and what we've seen him do in the past, but it just hasn't all fully come together. But he has had very successful seasons over the years. But other names that fall into this, Devontae Smith, Jordan Addison, even with that 3-game suspension, he features in the 20% range. And once we start to dip below that, we start to get into CD Lamb, and the player that I kind of wish I had more of, that I've hyped up all season, and people are probably like, why haven't you mentioned his name yet? That is George Kittle. Wish I had drafted more George Kittle, but based just on how ADP, I was talking with Sean, we're drafting a lot, and we're ending up getting the 101 or the 102 in quite a few of the drafts we were having. And then when it gets back to you in the tight end premium format in the second round, there's a lot of times George Kittle goes 1 pick before you. So just have missed out based on some of those drafts. I've been able to draft George Kittle. Wish I had some more sprinkled in, but you only get 1 pick in that range per draft, unless you're back to back at the turn, and he's not really making the turn, and you can't take him in the first round. So we get in then to just lots of rookie names, the rookie running backs, the 0 RB kind of guys as you move on down, some late stashes, dart throws, but nothing really, I don't think, that as we get down through them that's astonishing that stands out. One thing I would say, like Trey McBride down at 10%, again, just been where it's gone in the draft area. Same for Malik Neighbors. Wish just there was more sprinkled in there. Less Drake London than I would have really liked to get. Less George Pickens than I would have liked to get. Like, it's just been a little bit tougher to draft some of those names based on how the drafts go and how kind of the camp news is that week and where they end up getting drafted. Looking here, Ashton Jeanty, again, somebody I kind of would like to have more of, but find it hard to make that decision when on the clock based on the other players that are around it. Jameson Williams, very low compared to where I would be in terms of how I feel about him versus where he's going. this one will probably astonish some people. Xavier Worthy versus my Ted McMillan, where you're on the clock a lot of the times. Recently, I have been taking Ted McMillan in those situations. He's one of my most drafted players. Maybe I should have balanced that out a little bit more when I was on the clock between him and Worthy, because Worthy's right down there at about 7%. And then we get down to Travis Hunter at 6%. Wish I had more of some of those names that I've talked a lot about. And I've been trying to add to those rosters. But the key is the FFPC main event that I'm doing with Sean is happening in the next kind of 5 hours from now. And what that's going to allow me to do is, put a lot of extra dollars down on the names that I have talked about. But one of my goals is always to draft the players I'm talking about. So it's not been a case of like trying to avoid those names and not draft them. So a little bit disappointed, I must say, that I have gone that way. And if you look at the Packers, for example, I'm down at 6% on Matthew Golden versus the high percentage that I mentioned on Jaden Reed. So again, some of it was the early offseason optimism for me with Jaden Reed in the offense, and then some of it has been just the way the costs have flipped. It hasn't been as advantageous to take Golden versus some of those names that I mentioned a moment ago when I'm on the clock. So wish I could have balanced some of that out a little bit better. But as I mentioned, I'm kind of going off my priority targets. And then when I'm on the clock, that leads to those decisions. When we look through the ADP in terms of some of the players that I've completely faded that I'm worried about, that'll be what we kind of close out on here on this one. And hopefully people have enjoyed listening in. Let me know some of your feedback as I work through some of these kind of solo show ideas. But on this one, and this is probably more a stream of consciousness as thoughts come out as I look at the names that I have seen that are not on my rosters. But I was surprised about the Ginty rostership lower than I would have liked. But when we talk a lot this offseason, we've talked about kind of 16 first-round players, kind of a round and a half of first-round options. I don't really think there's any of those players in the first round and a half that are essentially bad picks. And you could say that like all the way, like, you could add even a Jonathan Taylor, a George Kittle, Bucky Irving, Chase Brown to that mix. Based on his receiving profile, I'm not as optimistic, on Derrick Henry, but Derrick Henry has been an absolute workhorse beast of a running back for the majority of his career, if not all of it. Those early seasons, maybe not as much, but has stayed healthy and is in a very dominant offense. So there's a really strong area there of the draft, but I haven't been in a situation where I've drafted him over the likes of a Brian Thomas or a Drake London. I would prefer to take those in those situations. Some of the players, though, again, Saquon Barkley was a player I faded last year that in the end was the wrong decision based on the result. Based on the type of players, particularly the running back position, I try and target, and then the players that I tend to avoid. Barkley fitted all that last year, had a lot of success this year, and based on the ADP and where he's going, it doesn't really fit into the targets that I'm going to have. I mentioned Brock Bowers earlier. He's like in the best ball tournament going one pick after by ADP, then Saquon Barkley at the 106. Barkley's the 105, and in those situations, if I'm on the clock at the 105, I'm likely taking Justin Jefferson or Bowers over Saquon Barkley and those situations. So that is a player again who maybe it happens again and lightning strikes twice, and it's a really tough one to take. It was tough to take last year on the Barkley fade, but he is in the kind of fade category again for me. Josh Jacobs, I talked a lot about early in the offseason as him being a fade, has continued to be a fade, but I must say that with how the Packers have moved, both from an office perspective and trying to add players to push them into a Super Bowl window here. But when you look at having the defensive game to kind of help add a little bit to the run game, I was hoping it was more going to be a case that the overall offense was going to lead more in the pass, and that was going to lead to be a good situation for the receivers rather than really hype up Josh Jacobs like the offense did last year. There was also, earlier in the offseason, I was talking about the running backs behind him and how that may lead to him, getting kind of losing some of that work as the season went on. That isn't really looking to be a strong case now based on how everything is played out with, injuries, with the players coming in really not being at the same level as a Josh Jacobs. So Jacobs is a fade, and it's going to be a tricky one to see how it plays out. He could do the same as he did last year, but I do think that that's kind of the peak of what he would do. But he's been a fade. I mentioned Jaquez Hunter. I've been kind of bullish since the draft that he has a chance as the season goes on to work into Kyron Williams' workload. Obviously, that he get the contract extension. We'll see how it plays out, but it's a contract that I don't think that the team can't like start to lean in a different direction if the talent of a Hunter or even let's say a Blake Corum, but he didn't have that impact last year. Could work into Kyron Williams, but he has been somebody that I have faded throughout the course of the offseason. James Cook, another running back, based on the contract situation, based on how his scores came last year with those long runs for touchdowns. Can he be that efficient again? Maybe he can. The Bills are awesome with their run scheme and opening up those plays. So maybe Cook again does deliver there. But that's the area I talk about, the flat draft, where you get like JSN, Jaden Higgins, Trevion Henderson, Ted McMillan, just some other targets that I would prefer to have on the roster versus a James Cook and that their corner of the 3-4 turn. Haven't drafted Devontae Adams at all. He's been one of my favorite NFL players of all time, being a Packers fan, but I've just faded it at the cost and with the Matthew Stafford kind of issue that is going on in terms of how his back health will be throughout the course of the season. Alvin Kamara, kind of see the Saquon Barkley age and veteran running back argument. The one thing with Kamara that he's always had that some of these running backs who are aging out wouldn't have is like a massive PPR floor where the team is going to get him those targets. But again, getting up there in years and much closer to the end of his career than the start. But it could be a case that the Saints offense really needs to get the ball to the running backs to try and get that offense moving. So Kamara could outproduce ADP, but I don't think he's one of those guys who is going to crush you even if he hits. I think some of the wide receivers in McMillan and Worthy who are going in that range have far more upside than an Alvin Kamara. It feels like a safe play, I think, to a lot of people, but I think it's safe based on history versus based on future. And I'm always looking ahead to the future in these situations. And as we look through, the next couple of rounds there, it's mainly I would class players I'm fading as those early rounds where they're high leverage rounds, and they're the players that are going to have an impact. It's interesting to see over the last couple of weeks, like Emeka Egbuka was somebody that I was drafting maybe 2 months ago, and I thought was very underpriced. I do see that he's just going very, very close and closing in on Mike Evans by a round as ADP continues to move here. So he's creeping up. But I think that in general, once you get past that point, like if we look at the tight ends, it's probably an area maybe more I'm fading, or that tier of Travis Kelce particularly. I haven't been drafting Kelce at all. And I just think that he's been fading. And I think that the offense probably needs to have him as the option 2 or the option 3 in it, where I think it can be successful as a possession kind of receiver in those situations. But we need to move into the more dynamic playmakers that the Chiefs have and Worthy, and then factor in Rashee Rice when he comes back from suspension. Maybe see what like the likes of Jalen Royals has. But Kelsey's a legendary player. But I think that he's kind of again beyond his best, and I'm trying to target players that are mispriced based on people thinking that they are not going to ascend to those levels versus players who have ascended to those levels who may have some floor, but the ceiling is no longer there. So that kind of is the area I would be saying that I've completely faded players to. When we look through the rest of the names I'm looking here, like there's some of them that I'm like, yeah, I'm not really drafting, like a Zach Ertz who I mentioned, but in the right situation that I would take. But I think as you get later in the draft, you're like, oh, I'm not drafting Najee Harris. Obviously, Najee Harris he's the first name I seen on the board here, but he's had a lot of stuff obviously going on in the offseason with the eye situation. But like, I think you're like down in the 14th round. It's like, well, that's okay. Like, we don't really need to get into those details. You're not really putting much you're not putting your neck on the line making those calls. But that is kind of the range of players that I've been fading. I'm going to have a quick look at QB here. Haven't drafted a lot of Patrick Mahomes, but that's just based on the zone that he's going in, liking some of the other names that we've talked about already on the show. Most of the QBs this year I felt are underpriced. I feel like the QB window has had a lot of names in there where you can kind of pick whichever ones you want. It gives you a lot of opportunities. The elite QBs are all pretty much fine. Some people might like Joe Burrow more than I do based on his rushing potential. And I'm saying that there's a lack of it versus the likes of a Jaden Daniels or a Lamar Jackson or Josh Allen. But he does have, two of the toppest of top tier wide receivers at his disposal. So I think that, if you want to go from that direction, that's fine. But overall, I think the QB position has been very fairly priced for the way I would like to draft. And if you're looking at the elite QB or the QB in the window, I think that's fine. The other ones, like I was surprised earlier in the offseason where Caleb Williams was, and he's continued to kind of like drop down a little by little by little, but still a QB 14. Haven't drafted any Caleb Williams. Just I don't really know. Again, we're kind of at the point where we were with Bryce Young last year, so it can turn around very quickly, and he has all the weapons around him to be able to turn it around. So we'll see if that plays out there. But that is where we're going to finish up for this episode. I don't really know what to call it. The players I drafted the most, the players I drafted the least, the players I'm afraid of, whatever. We'll see. I'll come up with a title of it before it posts, but I wanted to jump on, have some conversation, and see how it plays out as I experiment with the kind of solo podcast elements ahead of the season, because I might jump on and do some like instant recaps, because with the time difference, when I get up on a Monday AM, it's going to be maybe 2 a.m. Eastern. At the moment, with the young guy in the house who's approaching 1, a lot of the time I'm up at 1 a.m. Eastern, because that's 6 a.m. my time. And that leads to chances to, jump on, record a solo pod like this without a guest, but have it ready for people when they wake up early in the morning to, if they're on their commute. I always love hearing how people listen to the show. Some people were messaging and, doing yard work over the last week, but there's people that are doing all sorts of jobs around the house or heading to their job, whatever way it is. But, nice to see that notification that there's a new podcast available. So send me your suggestions, any ways that you'd like to hear some of the stuff broke down, and I'll be happy to try, if possible, to implement it into the network feed. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on social media at Overtime, and you can get in touch over there, or you can get in touch as well, rotovizradio@gmail.com. Appreciate everyone listening in. Obviously, as I said before, good luck in your fantasy football season. We are also, as I mentioned, the main event coming, myself and Sean Siegel. Hopefully we crush that draft. We'll see what draft slot we get. That isn't released yet. We'll also be seeing how that team plays out. So all that and more to come on the RotoViz Radio Podcast Network. Of course, on RotoViz Overtime, as always, on the RotoViz Fantasy Football Show, you can find myself. And until we are back, have a good one.